Hello and welcome to another Views from the Valley, your weekly roundup of the news here in the United States, coming to you from the v3.co.uk offices in San Francisco. With me as ever is Shaun Nichols. Hi Shaun.
Hi Ian.
Right, okay, first story of the week, and it's yet another story about Apple. Okay, we've been having a lot of these, but still.
Apple has released didn't release, but they've given all the details on the latest iPhone update, iPhone OS 4.0. Initially this summer it's going to be the iPhone version is out, and then later in the fall iPad is also going to get the update. Some big things, though a lot of them were already reported.
Well, you're actually going to get multitasking this time.
Multitasking this time
it's nice to see the operating system getting into the 1990s.
Well, for the 3GS and the more recent version.
Yes, if you've got an older iPhone, then you may as well just use it.
Well, yeah, the first generation iPhone actually will not even be able to install this update. I'm sure Apple's probably going to put in security fixes and everything as a separate update, but all the bells and whistles you're not going to get. So there's that. There's also the addition of ads for developers, which is a good thing, definitely.
Possibly not for users, but certainly for developers.
Maybe not so much for users, but definitely for developers. Also the ability to do folders, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that is a big step for them, because that's been one of the key complaints I've heard from iPad and iPhone users.
Yeah, so it is kind of a mixed bag, though. Users aren't going to like the ads. Companies also tightened up restrictions on what programming languages can be used. I think we saw this.
Adobe,
Java, C++, so no Flash, not even Flash development now.
Yeah, well, I did a story on Friday with an Apple evangelist, exactly telling Apple to go screw, this has caused a certain amount of frustration in the which is odd, because they used to be so close.
Yeah, they used to be, and you can argue that from an enterprise standpoint, Adobe kind of sustained Apple through some of its years in the mid-90s where it was really struggling.
Apple provided the font technology to make the laser writer work, and that was basically the Apple's any kind of Apple.
Well, and there were years where in the business place outside of technology and some of the home space, Photoshop, Illustrator, PageMaker were huge sellers, huge selling points for Apple systems, along with desktop publishing.
Even here, our design office runs completely on Apple. It's one of the strongest vertical sectors for the company. But we'll see what develops. But I've got a feeling the Adobe Apple war is going to build and build and build.
Well, they do need each other a fair amount, so I think at some point they'll settle it.
Yeah, but none of Jobs likes are fine. That's the thing. He loves having an enemy who he can sort of really go after.
Well, there's always Google.
Yeah. Although Steve Jobs was a couple of weeks ago seen having coffee with Eric Schmidt very publicly in a local coffee shop, and I'm assured by Apple contacts that yes, the photos were exactly real, because you couldn't get a lookalike who was that skinny. But we shall see. But it's I'm not making the joke, okay? Also staying with the smartphone news, however, Microsoft has got into the sphere with the launch of two new handsets, or rather they will be launched in May in the US and in the autumn in Europe. The Kin series, the Kin 1 and 2. Now, basically, if you remember the old handsets just used for texting that came out about 5 years ago, then they look pretty much like this. They're manufactured by Sharp, unusually, because usually it's HTC that does Microsoft's phones for it. But these are phones built around social networking. So it's a Windows 7 largely operating system with a fancy new UI on the front, so that you can skim through your Facebook and Twitter and drag and drop everything into a single point, so it immediately gets splurged out to all of your social networks. Basically, we're going to see a huge amount of social networking spam from these handsets, as far as I can see. But you've read the story. What do you think?
I think they might as well just call it the Zune phone, because I think it's probably going to have the same fate.
That's a little hard. Well,
I am somewhat skeptic about Microsoft's ability to kind of put out killer devices in any space, just because they don't really. The Xbox needed Halo really to take off. Well, and it had great online play.
Yes,
there's
some upgrades as well.
But as far as interface design, usability, that sort of thing, they're not
Microsoft's strong points.
And when you're doing the thing that everybody else is kind of running away from doing at the time, it's usually a bad sign. Once in a while it works and you look brilliant, but usually if you go against the crowd, there's a good reason they're not doing that.
Yeah. Also, tiny screens. Not one of them. The smallest screen is 2.1 inches, which is pretty much useless for internet use. And the largest is 3.5, which, when you compare to an iPhone or any other touch phone, then I just can't see the kids getting that excited about this.
No, and the reason so many kids and so many people like things like Twitter and Facebook is because they're free. You can use them online in your browser without charge.
Yeah.
You'll get the ads, you get all that, but they're basically free to use. And when you start putting in fairly expensive applications, things like remember there was the Twitter handset a while back. And that sort of things that make people pay a large amount for that stuff.
Did anybody actually buy that piece of, that terribly flawed device?
I don't know. If you get an angry email from their PR department tomorrow informing you that it's actually sold quite well.
I could live with that. I'd be curious to see what the sales stats are, but still. I know what you mean. These come across as very much a one-trick pony. And I've got to say, nice QWERTY keyboard, hard keyboard is always very nice, but I think the kids have got more style. So we'll see how that develops. But sticking with Microsoft news, I've just come out of a conference today, and Microsoft has been talking up the new Azure cloud platform. Basically, they've made a number of commitments. It will support open source standards like Java and Ruby on Rails. It will provide discounts and money back if it drops below a 99.9 on service level record. And they're really pushing this very hard, and along with an SQL version of Azure as well. What do you reckon, though? Microsoft in the cloud space? I can see them getting into it because their traditional market's being eroded, but I just don't see the market trust out there.
No, and it's not really that way for anybody. And when your Microsoft company has kind of had this rep, whether fair or not in recent years. In recent years they've done a lot to improve their security, that sort of thing.
True. That's
but
true.
Nobody right now is selling anybody on enterprise cloud services as being secure at all.
No.
One advantage Microsoft does have is there are large stretches of the industry, things like SQL, that sort of thing, where people are kind of forced to use them. Whether the company's already running it or they just don't want to transition over, or it's just too expensive, or what.
It's like we were talking about the other day. You use Internet Explorer when you have to, Firefox for pleasure, and Opera if you come up with a site which you think is dodgy. So, I know what you mean about being forced to use it, but that was interesting when you raised the security point as well, because in the Q&A session they were just like, will you be offering any refunds if the data is stolen in any way? And it's just like, we'll get back to you on that, which I think is the nicest possible way of saying, you've got to be kidding.
Well, and in this case you can't necessarily single Microsoft out, because like I said, we saw at RSA this year, nobody's even close to figuring it out, really. Cloud security that's actually people are going to trust is a long, long ways off, it seems like.
Yeah, Microsoft were making much about, you get an authentication token. Well, those have always worked in the past, haven't they? So yes, we shall see on that one. But finally, sadly not the final jokey item, because it's quite a bad one as far as the Britain and Europe is concerned. You covered a report from Forrester which made disturbing reading.
Well, depending on where you're at, it was disturbing, and it's not a huge deal. Basically, they're saying they're going to have to tweak their reports for the recovery, saying that the U.S. is actually going to see a fairly decent bump in its recovery. I think it was up from 6-something to 8. I think it was around a 1.5% jump in expected growth this year. Whereas the rest of the globe as a whole is going to be down about 0.4%. Not a big hit, but they think that a lot of it is going to come from Europe because of the weakening EU versus the dollar. Basically, their premise was Greece, everything going on with Greece.
Yeah, Greece is going down in flames. It's pulling the price of the euro down.
Exactly. So it's going to strengthen the dollar, extend the kind of boost the U.S. recovery, but as a whole, everybody else might suffer a little bit, particularly Europe.
Yeah. No, definitely. It's the Greek situation is causing an awful lot of concern, both here and in Europe. From what a European office tells us. Okay, concern amongst some gleeful crowing amongst some of American commentators about how the great European socialist experiment is failing. But we shall see how that works out.
Well, we kind of need a weak dollar because our salaries kind of we're real cheap labor when the dollar's weak. We're all for that.
But it was interesting that the Forrester report didn't actually really said that it all comes down to currency fluctuation. There's no technological reason why the US should come out of recession sooner than Europe. But certainly some worrying readings, and a good example of how non-tech matters can have a very real impact when it comes to the tech industry. Anyway, you can read these stories and more on v3.co.uk, and we'll be back next week. start the remote and then go and check the camera again, so you get... Okay. Right, well, we'll lead off with iPhone 4, then do Microsoft Kin, Microsoft Azure, and then land on the Forrester report.
Okay.
Okay.